I'm Dennis White, a member of the Rotary Club of Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, District 6220 in the United States. I'm also a clinical psychologist and a former American Peace Corps volunteer. For many years I've been doing training for students, parents, and Rotarians in issues related to crossing cultures. The video you're about to see is one that I've done many times in districts in the United States and around the world. It was recorded in Grand Rapids, Michigan at the Central States Rotary Youth Exchange Summer Conference in July of 2005. I hope it will be useful for you in preparing for your Rotary Youth Exchange experience. At the end of this video, I will share with you some information about other resources available to you to help prepare you for Youth Exchange. Thank you. Today I want to talk about understanding cultural differences, not only at the level of behavior, but also at the level of the underlying values beneath them. Most of us have a basic idea of what culture is, at least in terms of differences in custom, in language, in food, and clothing. And also, most of us have a fairly good idea of what values are. Concepts like honesty, fairness, and the common good. Concepts that are set forth in the Rotary four-way test. However, we start to get in trouble when we begin to talk about cultural values, because it's not unusual for people to assume that most, if not all, values are universal. And even if they don't think that all values are universal, they often think that their values are the correct ones. In reality, values vary considerably from culture to culture. And since values are the basis of most behavior, understanding those differences in values can go a long way toward helping us understand otherwise strange and often completely irrational looking behavior. But learning to genuinely understand another culture actually is really very difficult. And we usually see and hear what we expect to see and hear, even if we're mistaken. I have a visual image to demonstrate this in the form of this very, very familiar logo from FedEx. At first glance, it's pretty straightforward, the word FedEx. But as you look more closely at it, can anybody here see an arrow in that logo? As you look closely, you may begin to see it. And when you do, you have that aha experience. And sometimes it takes some work to see it. But that's what happens metaphorically when we begin to see another culture for what it is. If we're looking at what we think is familiar, we may never see the real differences in cultures. By the way, for those of you who hadn't seen it, there's the arrow. Aha! Okay. Now, the good news is that once you do see it, it's fairly easy to see it again. In fact, many people say that they can't not see it from now on, once it's been pointed out to them. And that's the good news when we cross cultures as well. Because once we know that cultural differences exist, it's hard not to look for those differences as a way to understand the culture, rather than to automatically look for similarities. Now, when we speak of culture, we're talking about an integrated pattern of thoughts and feelings and behaviors shared by any particular group of people. These patterns are usually very logical and consistent when they're viewed from the inside, although they often appear illogical and inconsistent when viewed from the outside. And the thoughts and feelings that are beneath those behaviors are often unspoken, unseen, and even unconscious. So if you think of culture as an iceberg floating in the ocean, behavior can be seen as the tip of the cultural iceberg, exposed above the surface, but representing only about 1/8 of what is there. The bulk of the cultural iceberg, 7/8, is hidden beneath the surface. And it's often difficult to understand overt behavior exhibited in another culture, even when we can see it. It's even more difficult to understand those hidden values that are underneath. And since there are at least 200 recognized sovereign nations on Earth, and over 2,000 identifiable cultural ethnic groups, there's still plenty of opportunity for misunderstanding. both between nations and among cultures within nations. But if we can begin to better understand those hidden values beneath the surface, we have a much better chance of understanding other cultures. Now, many of us have had encounters where we misinterpreted or otherwise misunderstood culture-based behavior, especially when we thought it was familiar. In the United States, this thumbs-up gesture is a sign that everything's okay. Great. But in much of the world, it's actually an obscene gesture, the equivalent of giving the finger in the United States. This is the equivalent of giving the finger. Now, I was in the American Peace Corps in Iran during the time that American astronauts were landing on the moon. And every time they would get in or get out of a space capsule to signal that everything was okay, they would do this. Now, you can imagine what that seemed like to the Iranians who thought of this as giving the finger. Why would he be purposely insulting everyone and being so rude? Now, recently I heard a modern update to this story. A middle school teacher was helping her students understand some issues in the ongoing conflict in Iraq. And she'd explained the meaning of this gesture in many Islamic countries. And she explained it to the students as they were watching a videotape of American soldiers going through a street scene crowded with Iraqis, all doing this. So they developed a better insight for what that meant. Now, a few minutes later, the middle school principal dropped in to talk with the teacher for a few minutes. And you can imagine, all these students greeted their principal with smart kids. Now, simple mistakes in language can cause misunderstanding too, not just gestures. Just because we think we know what a word means doesn't mean we necessarily do. In language, this is often because we try to translate words literally when they're actually idiomatic expressions. This works sometimes, but it can lead to some embarrassing difficulties. The Swedish manufacturer of the vacuum cleaner Electrolux was coming up with a new ad campaign in the United States. Now, the word suck has more than one meaning in English, especially in the United States. One meaning is to draw air or water through a vacuum, which is how a vacuum cleaner cleans a carpet. But we also know that it has another meaning in contemporary American English, which means something's disgusting, awful, or terrible. So can you imagine the slogan they came up with? Nothing sucks like Electrolux. Now, this ad, as you might expect, didn't last very long. But a couple of weeks ago, a Swedish gentleman told me that in reality, the publicity generated from this mistake, plus the fact that it's such a popular phrase with young people, made it a public relations success after all, even though they withdrew the ad. Now, in case you think I'm making fun of people who don't speak English very well, I want to tell you that English is one of the hardest languages in the world to learn. What other language could give us this next sentence I'm going to show you? With one word used 4 different ways with 2 pronunciations, all in one sentence. Since the boss is present, there's no time like the present to present him with his present. You're a foreign student, and you want to know what in the world does this sentence mean, and why did you say it that way? Well, I had an exchange student suggest to me that maybe we should say, since the boss is now here, there's no better time than now to give him his gift. He said that would be much less confusing, and I think he was right. Now, when we do make those inevitable mistakes that happen when we cross cultures, everybody does it. It certainly helps if we can have a sense of humor about it. When President Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline were visiting Mexico, Kennedy was speaking with the President of Mexico about something, and at the same time he admired a beautiful wristwatch that the President of Mexico had. Now, in many countries, it's customary if someone admires a possession of yours for you to offer it to them as a gift. As the President of Mexico was offering his watch to President Kennedy, one of Kennedy's aides whispered into his ear what the custom was. So Kennedy, trying to be culturally sensitive, graciously accepted the watch. Fine. Later, when the 2 presidents and their wives were riding in a motorcade, the President of Mexico commented to Kennedy on how beautiful he thought his wife Jacqueline was. President Kennedy, without missing a beat, said, "Mr. President, please take your watch back." Now, when I was in my first year in the American Peace Corps in Iran, I was still struggling quite a bit with the language. And many words sounded alike, especially ones that had sounds that I'd never been exposed to, like the "h" sound, which is kind of hard to do even when you're practicing it. Now, the difference between the word eat and the word read in Farsi depends in part on that sound, and I wasn't very good at it. So one evening, a friend knocked on my door to make a social call, and I'd been reading a book at the time. He asked if he was disturbing me, and I said, "No, I was just eating a book." And he thought this was pretty funny, so much so that for the next 2 years, every time I would see him, he would say the equivalent in Farsi of, "Hey Dennis, have you eaten any good books lately?" Instead of getting angry, I just let him laugh because it was pretty funny. But these kinds of mistakes, misinterpreting gestures or feeling awkward with a social custom, or incorrectly translating words, all of these things are not usually going to cause a lot of trouble. They're mistakes that can make us uncomfortable, and they can be a part of that initial culture shock, but the mistakes and misunderstanding at the level of cultural values are usually much more subtly hidden and much more serious. When Nikita Khrushchev was visiting the United States in 1959, it was a goodwill trip. And when he gave a speech, or when he got in or out of an airplane, he would make this gesture. Okay? And most Americans, especially the American press, interpreted it as a competitive, hostile sign of victory. The same kind of sign that a boxer, a prize fighter would make to say, I won, we're number one. Well, in Russia, this gesture is symbolic of two people shaking hands. It's not a competitive signal at all. But that's not the way it was interpreted. So imagine some of the cultural and diplomatic opportunities that were missed just because of that simple misunderstanding. And it happens all the time. There can be even more difficult and serious misunderstandings at the levels of attitudes and beliefs, and this is because of the basic phenomenon called ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the tendency for all cultures to see their own practices and beliefs as the correct way, sometimes the only way to view reality. By contrast, an ethno-relative point of view of the world is more difficult and more complicated, but it is the only effective way to confront the very real differences that exist among people. Ethno-relativism says that all cultures are valid expressions of values, whether we agree with them or not. Ethno-relativism says that we don't have to be alike or always agree in order to get along. I'd like you to consider this statement from Canadian anthropologist Wade Davis, who puts it bluntly but eloquently and says, "The world in which you were born is just one model of reality. Other cultures are not failed attempts at being like you. They are unique manifestations of the human spirit." And yet, the almost instinctive tendency to view things ethnocentrically is difficult for some people to give up. In James Hilton's novel, Lost Horizon, an American stranded in Shangri-La says to his Tibetan rescuer, "I want to get back to civilization as soon as possible." The Tibetan's reply was, "Are you so very sure that you're away from it?" A different view of civilization. When Mahatma Gandhi was in England, reporters were interviewing him and asked him what he thought of Western civilization. His reply was, "I think it would be a good idea." And sometimes ethnocentrism can take us to some very humorous extremes. This usually happens when people don't understand that some of their own cultural values were actually borrowed from another culture. So, believe it or not, it's not terribly unusual for an American student to ask an Italian exchange student if they have pizza in Italy. There's a supposedly true story about a statement made by President George Bush. I don't know for sure if it's true, but I'm not going to let the truth get in the way of a good story, so I'm going to tell it anyway. At one point when President Bush was being critical of France for, among other things, what he considered to be their lack of competitive spirit in business, he is reported to have said, "The trouble with the French is they just don't have a word for entrepreneur."
Probably likely to.
Can't say for sure. Now, how do different cultures develop so many fundamentally different values? All cultures must answer 5 basic questions. They are, what is human nature? How do humans relate to nature or the environment? What is the main focus of human activity? What is the nature of human activity? And how do humans relate to one another? Now, all cultures answer these questions, but they don't all answer them the same way. And depending on the particular combination of answers, we get some very specific cultural values and resulting behaviors. Some of these values can best be understood when viewed from opposite poles. For example, individualism versus group orientation, or formality, well, it's not cooperating, versus informality, past orientation versus future orientation, directness versus indirectness, and change versus permanence. These are just a very few examples of cultural values. Now let's look more closely at just a few of these. I'll take change versus permanence. Now in the United States, change is almost always considered good. For many years, General Electric had as its slogan, many of the older people in the audience can probably recite it with me, "Progress is our most important product," meaning that change itself is a good thing. It's like saying that if something is new, it must be better. And people who don't handle change well in our culture are seen as backward, stubborn, and they're often sent off to continuing education courses to learn to deal better with change, because they just don't fit in. Now let's contrast this to much of the Islamic world. There is an Islamic proverb that says, "Better 1,000 years of tyranny than one day of chaos." Imagine what that means. When Saudi Arabia was celebrating an anniversary of its founding, its slogan was 60 years of progress without change. Now that was perfectly logical and consistent from within that culture. Much of the rest of the world views permanence and stability as even higher values than individual freedom. You're not supposed to agree with that, but you need to understand that. Now we can also look at individualism versus group orientation. In the United States, we talk a lot, for example, about family values, but we are referring always to the nuclear family, mom, dad, and children. When children grow up, they leave the nest. That's a term we use. And they may actually travel hundreds of miles away to live. And we don't pay a lot of attention to extended family other than calling someone a first cousin. The individual is the main focus of activity, achievement, and attention in our culture. But in other cultures, extended family relationships are much more important. In Farsi, which is what they speak in Iran, one phrase tells me that someone is my father's brother's oldest son. One phrase. That tells us how important that is. We call them a cousin. In any culture, people say they value family, so we might begin to think that's a universal cultural value. But let's do a little survey among us here. How many of those of you who are Americans in the room have in your purses, your wallets, or on your desks at work, only those places, do you have pictures of your children? Show of hands. Quite a few people. All right. Same people now that raised your hands. How many of you in those same places, your wallet, your purse, or your desk at work, have pictures of your parents or your grandparents? Not many hands. Now, if we were in China, there would be photos of parents and grandparents in all the places that we have photos of our children. So both cultures use the word family, but they're not talking about the same people at all. Again, it's easy to mistakenly classify many behaviors as universal because they look the same, when it may be the underlying reasons, the bottom of that iceberg, that explain the differences. Everyone is familiar with personal music devices. Walkman, Discman, iPod, they're everywhere, and they seem to be popular everywhere. But when the Sony Corporation was first test marketing the Walkman, they had focus groups that they surveyed. They asked people why they liked these devices. The Americans said they liked them because they could listen to the music they wanted to without being disturbed by anybody else. The Japanese customers said they liked them because they could listen to the music they wanted without disturbing anybody else. Same consumer behavior, completely different reasons. The American value was to turn inward to the individual. The Japanese value was to turn outward to the group. Now let's complicate things even more. I'm going to put values of change versus permanence and combine it with individual and group loyalties. And these loyalties can extend to religious, ethnic, and family groups. Americans and many other Westerners are baffled by factionalism in the Middle East. But in much of the Middle East, loyalty is not to an abstract concept like nation. It's more often to a regional, ethnic, or even extended family entity that has remained unchanged through literally thousands of years of occupation, empires, and dictatorships. We had a Fulbright exchange teacher in our community not long ago from Jordan, and she explained to us that her city, which was a fairly large city, was basically one extended family clan. Everybody was related to everybody else. So we had a culture where loyalties were to permanence and to family. Now, as change threatens the stability of that culture, they're more likely to turn inward to the clan than they are to extend themselves to an abstract concept like nation. And they will lay low and wait for whatever political entity comes and goes, each being replaced by another over centuries, and they will have a limited loyalty to any of them. So think, cultivating democracy and Western nation states in an environment like that is a formidable goal. It tells us a little bit of why things are happening with such difficulty. Another values dichotomy is formality versus informality. In many cultures, more formal dress, speech, and even the use of last names and titles is the preferred way of addressing people. In the United States, on the other hand, we carry informality to its extreme. We are so informal in this country that it's almost impossible to shock Americans with more informality than they're comfortable with. But I think I found a way. Actually, it's an illustration that tells you how people from other cultures might feel when they experience our informality. So, when many foreigners come to the United States, if they're addressed by their first names, or when their hosts say, "Call me by my first name," they're extremely uncomfortable. And I'm telling you, it would be the equivalent of me asking you for the rest of this conference to just call me Sweetie Pie. Most of the Americans in this group would find that uncomfortable, or at least I hope so. Because we don't know one another well enough for you to call me an endearing name like that. And that's exactly the way a foreigner feels when we say, just call me Dennis, just call me Barb. That's the concept of formality and informality related to comfort level. We assume that the more informal someone is, the more comfortable they are. When in reality, in many cultures, the more formal they are, the more comfortable they are. So when we say, let your hair down or loosen your tie, we're not making them feel more comfortable. Let's look at just one more example. Directness versus indirectness. In many countries, indirectness has been elevated to an art form to maintain social standing and harmony, or what we call saving face. A woman studying in Japan wrote an article called 30 Ways of Saying No Without Saying No, Indirect Ways. Polite saving of face is a value in many, many cultures, and someone from a direct culture will be lost, confused, and frustrated with this indirect ways of saying things. Consider this case of an Ecuadorian host mom and an American exchange daughter living together. The daughter says, "I would like to go with my friends to a movie tonight." The host mother says, "I hope you have a good time." The American daughter's reaction, "It must be okay." She didn't say no. When she was told later, many months later, that her host mother was really not happy with her going out so often, she said, "Well, if she didn't want me to go, she should have said no." Now, what did she miss? There were lots and lots of clues. For one thing, the mother never said yes, so she was saying no. Did the student understand or notice what the other Ecuadorian teenagers were doing? She actually had noticed, because when her family visited later in the year, she commented to her mother, "These Ecuadorian teenagers stay home all the time," as if to say, "Isn't that strange?" Kind of like looking at the FedEx logo, but not seeing the arrow. Did she ask other Ecuadorians what the usual customs were for kids going out? Did she consider having someone approach her host mother and saying, "How am I doing? Can she give me some feedback?" None of these options would have occurred naturally to this American girl. It would be like telling her to do everything with her opposite hand. She could do it, but only if she thought about it, and only if she practiced it. In fact, she did what came naturally, so she would ask to go out, and if she was not told no, she assumed it was yes. Now, these are just a few examples of the kinds of values that underlie cultural differences. We could come up with many, many of them. American cultural historian Robert Coles has actually listed 13 strongly held American cultural values that are characteristic of many Americans. And these can be contrasted with values of many other cultures to reveal how and why we have so much cultural misunderstanding. And I know that anyone working in intercultural exchanges experiences these problems as well. Students, adults, experienced travelers, we all carry our cultural values with us like excess baggage when we cross cultures. Keep in mind now that whenever these cultural differences are pointed out to us, especially for the first time, most people are shocked to hear that everyone doesn't view the world the way they do. And they're even more dismayed to find out that the values that they cherish so much are actually seen as negative by other people. Consider this encounter in a play by British playwright Tom Stoppard. In it, one British character is talking to another British character about his experiences living in the United States. He says, "Americans are a very patriotic people. They're very open and they wear their hearts on their sleeves. They don't stand on ceremony. They take people as they are. They make no distinction about a person's background. They say what they mean with real forcefulness. They invite you to visit them in their homes from the moment they meet you. They're irrepressible, good-humored, ambitious, and brimming with self-confidence in any company." Aside from all that, I have nothing against it. So, until you heard the last part, it was like, well, this guy gets it. Yeah, we're all right. And he was describing things that in his culture he found offensive, obnoxious, or at least unpleasant. Now, whenever I do training on the topic of developing intercultural sensitivity to youth exchange programs, to businesses, educators, in many parts of this country and other parts of the world, I find that people are actually quite open to hearing this kind of a message. I started making similar presentations to Rotary District Governors Conferences a few years ago, and I was initially quite concerned about whether they would be as accepting of this message as the typical youth exchange audience. But actually I was quite wrong, and I had to confront my own negative stereotyping of the average Rotarian, because they're really quite open to this kind of message. They can laugh with good humor at a description like the one from Tom Stoppard, and they can learn to think from an ethno-relative point of view. The point is that loyal, patriotic people can love their own countries and still accept that it doesn't always make them right or the best or more important than other cultures. I have a story that illustrates successful ethno-relative thinking in an exchange. An American exchange student was spending her first evening with her new host family in Germany. They all spoke English quite well, so language wasn't a real critical barrier. She decided to try to adapt to what she thought she knew about German culture. Now, normally in America, she would break the ice with small talk, talking about herself, her likes, dislikes, movies, fashion, music, those kinds of things. Instead, she'd been told that Germans often prefer to use topics like politics or religion to get to know someone. Now, this would be very risky opening conversation in America. In fact, these would be topics some people would never bring up. But after some period of silence, she decided to take a risk and asked her host family what they thought about the continuing American presence in Iraq, ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. Well, the family responded immediately with lively discussion, with a wide range of opinions on many different topics, all with great enthusiasm. Actually, this girl didn't say a whole lot more. She just kept asking them questions and acknowledging what they said. Now, at the end of the evening, after this girl had gone to bed, the host parents commented to one another, this American girl didn't seem as superficial as others that they had encountered. Because for these people, discussing topics like this is the way you get to know somebody. And so that was good outbound preparation, and that was a good exchange student. What are some lessons we can learn from this example? First, when you're in another culture, don't assume that the values that you have are shared by the culture you're in. Second, understand that the differences we make, when we encounter differences, we need to know more about our own hidden cultural values. Third, if you want to adapt to another culture, it will require you taking some risks and trying some new behaviors, like trying to do things with your opposite hand. It feels awkward, it doesn't go very well, but that's the only way you learn. And fourth, when I'm asked what's the best advice to give an exchange student or anybody crossing cultures, I say, be like Mickey Mouse. Right, what in the world does that mean? Let's think about Mickey Mouse. He's got great big ears, so he can listen very carefully. He's got great big eyes, so he can look at everything that he's seeing. And he's got a fairly small mouth, and he doesn't say very much, at least not at first. I used to come up with long lists of do's and don'ts when you're going to go abroad. And now I just say, be like Mickey Mouse. Listen, look, and don't say very much at first. I've already spoken about the importance of language in understanding cultural values. When we don't speak another language, we're almost completely dependent on interpreters for help, and that can be very tenuous. There's a story told about a Japanese translator who was assisting an American conducting a series of business meetings in Japan. Now, Americans have a habit of starting speeches with some sort of a joke as a way of showing their informality and that they're just one of the fellows. Two very strong American cultural values. Now, in Japan, these two values, neither one of these is a very important value. But he told the joke anyway. The Japanese audience didn't understand why he was bothering to tell a joke at a business meeting, and the Japanese interpreter knew that the joke wouldn't make any sense in the Japanese language. But he tried anyway. When it came to the punchline, the Japanese audience just sat there, staring politely, but certainly not laughing. After the speech, this businessman who really liked this joke explained it again to the interpreter, convinced that if he could just translate it properly, that the audience would get it. Now, true to his cultural values, the Japanese interpreter just was non-confrontational and, to save face, smiled and told the American he would try to do better. So this went on for several encounters until finally toward the end of the trip, when the businessman was telling the joke one more time, the interpreter said this: "This American is now beginning to tell a joke." It's a peculiar custom that they have at business meetings. Please smile attentively, and in a moment you'll come to the conclusion of the joke, where you're expected to laugh. Okay, laugh. Now. And they did. Well, this guy was thrilled. So much so that afterwards he went up to the interpreter and said, "I knew that joke was funny. You just had to know how to tell it right." Now, in all the groups that I work with in Youth Exchange, I have the greatest emotional attachment to the recently returned students that we call rebounds. I would like to close by talking just a few minutes about them, because they represent the immediate outcome of an awful lot of hard work by a lot of people. They demonstrate the incredible growth produced during an exchange year, but they also embody the often conflicting emotions that go with that experience. They love their native countries now, maybe in ways they never imagined they could, but they now also love at least one other country about as much. They're not quite ready to relinquish their status as exchange students, and they have trouble explaining all of this to anybody who might be interested. Many of you know students like this. I have one in my family. She was the student I referred to in the story about Ecuador. I would like you to keep those students that you have in mind as I recite a poem. Imagine those students now that you know of with their thoughts and their hearts in two different places at the same time. The poem is called Finlandia, but actually I like to call it the Rebound Prayer, because I think better than anything I've ever seen it expresses the essence of ethno-relativism. And the poem is, "This is my prayer, O God of all the nations, a prayer of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart lies. Here lie my hopes, my dreams like stars that shine. But other hearts and other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. My country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine. But other lands have sunlight too, and clover, and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Oh, hear my prayer, O God of all the nations, a prayer of peace for their land and for mine." For any of you devoting yourselves to Youth Exchange, your time, your effort, your concern, students, parents, volunteers, as we work at increasing cultural understanding, believe me, we are helping to bring peace for your land and for mine. Thank you for listening. Find all of the slides and full text of this presentation at the USA Canada Youth Exchange website, www.yeoresources.org. Feel free to use this presentation or modify the slides any way you wish. In addition, you will find other resources on the website with presentations on topics like culture shock, reverse culture shock, developing intercultural sensitivity, and understanding American cultural values. If you visit the website, you'll find other resources on books, training techniques, simulations, games, etc. If you find this site useful and you have something to contribute, please visit the site and give us your ideas about training resources to make the Youth Exchange experience better.